Hello and welcome to this talk for the Heritage Open Days for Gosport for 2020. Normally this talk is a 1-hour talk given in a church in Gosport, and it's been given on 2 different years, 2019 and 2018. This is the 2020 version, and for this version it's been split into 2 30-minute talks, of which this is the first one, which talks about the background to the census, how it came about and why it happened. My name is Neil Spurgeon, and I've made a bit of an investigation into what effectively is a unique religious census that was conducted in 1851 in Britain and has never been repeated. It's an old story. This tale occurs very early in the Christmas story, and many people vaguely remember it in one form or another. But as the section in brackets indicates, this was not the first and certainly not the last census to be undertaken, and the King James Version makes the reasoning behind this counting of the population very plain, that all the world should be taxed. Okay, so now let's bring this a bit closer to home. In 1086, officially, Gosport did not exist. Alverstoke and some other parts of the current borough that were defined as manors did exist and were named. Also, it is likely there were possibly a few cottagers living in the woods and doing a bit of fishing. Here Alverstoke, as one of the manors, is recorded in the Domesday Record. The Bishop of Winchester was the overlord of the village, and this gives us a starting point to investigate the population further. At this time, Alverstoke was a small but noteworthy place, having 20 households, 18 villagers and 2 smallholders. All men, of course. At this time women and children were seen but not counted, so probably a population of around 100 to 120 people. Keep this number in mind for the next slide, 600 years later. Now, family historians are very aware of the 1841 census, which is the first one of real value to them because it lists people by name. However, national censuses started in England in 1801, and the numbers can be very useful to local historians. Here I have listed the population of what is now the borough of Gosport for each decade from 1801 until the year we are especially interested in today, so that we can compare the growth of the borough against similar figures for the county. Technically that of course was Southampton from 1447 until 1959, and England as a whole. Notice that this area was growing faster after the end of the war with France. Waterloo was 1815, of course. Then the county population trend, although broadly in line with the country as a whole, falls behind. It's not until about 1850 that the county catches up with the national and local trends. Hampshire, or as we would now call it, in many ways a county much dependent upon the army and navy, suffered considerable depression in the period after the war with France ended in 1815, and this is reflected in population movement away from the coast and increased infant mortality because, in the main, of malnutrition. Now, with regard to a religious census, it's probably important to be clear what we are talking about. On this, round about 1840, very simplistic map, most of the churches are shown with a small plus cross, and there are relatively few of them. Not all places of worship are signified effectively, although if you're aware of the topology, it's easy to work out where some of the churches in existence at the time are sited. Note that while both Rowner and Crofton churches are marked with crosses, none are shown in our specific area on this map. And while the Ordnance Survey at a point just after the census does clearly indicate the town, still none of the churches are clearly defined, although the parsonage at Rowner is actually named. So we are British. We're going to conduct a census of those who go to church on Sunday the 30th of March 1851. The main subject of discussion in advance of this unique event, obviously the weather, and it was dreadful. This may have put people off from attending church. Certainly many of the hierarchy of the Church of England, who wanted high figures from the census they had tried to resist, partly to justify their existence and power, used this as an excuse for lower than hoped congregations when the numbers finally came to light. Of course, this was a time when religion was falling in popularity compared with science and technology, which were very much up in the air. Darwin's Origin of Species wouldn't be published for another 8 years, but enlightened thought among the more learned in society were already starting to question the accuracy of biblical ideas, and, as we will shortly see, church practice was a subject of widespread discussion. These ideas brought the question of conducting a religious census, alongside the more adventurous national census, very much into the foreground, and a decision to conduct this count of people at places of worship had been widely agreed as a useful objective for scientific study. The middle of the century was a time of considerable change, if not in belief, at least in form of worship. The Catholic Emancipation Act of 1828 had freed Catholics from their hidden position in English society. The Great Reform Act of 1832, more accurately the Representation of the People Act, had swept away the rotten boroughs and very slightly improved emancipation, but was seen as a wind of change in all aspects of public life, not least religion. Furthermore, for over a century, the independent dissenters had strongly defined an evangelical and biblical approach to worship, and the pendulum was ripe to swing. John Keble at Oriel College, Oxford, and the Tractarians had been busy publishing tracts for the Times between 1833 and 1840, and had formed the influential Oxford movement, who were keen to bring the somewhat moribund Church of England closer to the pre-Reformation Catholic liturgy, with much increased ritual and colour, while at the same time the evangelical wing of the Church of England, led by William Good and Isaac Taylor, and actively encouraged by the so-called muscular Christians of the Broad Church, epitomised by Dr. Thomas Arnold, were arguing for closer ties with the dissenter congregations who, by this point, were strong and vocal and highly critical of much of the establishment ways of operating, including those relating to religion and the right way to live. John Henry Newman, the vicar of the important university church in Oxford, who had replaced the ageing Keppel as the figurehead of this new movement, had converted to the Roman Catholic Church in 1845, later to become a cardinal. Archbishop Manning also converted to the Roman Catholics, and again also later earned the red hat of a cardinal. Their place as the key leaders of the Oxford Fathers, as they were by this time widely known, had been taken by Edward Bouverie Pusey. Because of his leadership and his willingness to stick his head above the parapet vacated by Manning and Newman, this led to this group becoming widely known as Puseyites. Meanwhile, the last of the Oriel Fathers in this image, which is a cartoon, is Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, to whom we will return in more detail in the next slide. The third son of William Wilberforce, the evangelical MP for Yorkshire, who drove emancipation through Parliament, had taken up residence in Elverstoke in 1841 and was instrumental in setting up a number of churches in the Gosport area. Just a week before the census, this man was denying in Parliament that the claims of the Daily News, a local newspaper, that there were no Tractarians in the Diocese of Oxford, and stating that he, the bishop, had not appointed Dr. Pusey to a preachership at Oxford University, although Pusey's, and to a certain extent the bishop's, high church views were widely publicised and very well known. During the same debate, an MP raised a question with the Home Secretary in Parliament, reported in the Hampshire Advertiser of March the 22nd, in which he questioned whether on this occasion Papers had been sent to ministers of religion, and he complained that the questions were vague and in some cases unwarrantable, including, quote, a statement that demanded the average number of persons attending the place of worship where they officiated. It would, he felt, be hardly possible for any clergyman to answer such questions unless he resorted to the practice of regularly reckoning in detail the members of his congregation. Samuel, Soapy Sam Wilberforce, was the third son of William Wilberforce, the great Liberal slave emancipation MP. Talk about a man with a best side. Every picture I can find of him is taken from his left frontage. Anyway, more to the point, he's a very important man with regards to the Church of England in the Gosport Peninsula. Sam went up to Oriel College as an undergraduate in 1823, graduating in 1826 with a first in mathematics and second in classics. Following a short curacy in Oxfordshire and a long role as vicar of Brightstone on the Isle of Wight, he wrote many tracts but was rejected by the Oriel Oxford movement as he had diverged quite sharply from their views in some areas, but he wrote much during this period, sometimes with his brother in collaboration. 1839 to 40 was a big year for him, especially with regard to Gosport. In November 1839 he was appointed Archdeacon of Surrey. In August 1840 he was collated as a Canon of Winchester, and in October 1840 he was appointed Rector of Ulverstoke. In 1841 he was chosen to give the Bampton Annual Lecture at Oxford, a forerunner of the BBC's Wreath Lectures but always on a theological subject, and shortly afterwards was made chaplain to Prince Albert. In 1843, obviously that was successful because he was appointed by the Archbishop of York to be sub-almoner to the Queen, a post which included acting as the domestic chaplain at Buckingham Palace and sub-dean of the Chapel Royal. In March 1845 he accepted the position of Dean of Westminster, and in October the same year was appointed as the Bishop of Oxford. And after some 24 years as the Lord Bishop of Oxford, he was translated late in his life in 1869 to become Bishop of Winchester, in many ways the third most important church position in England after the two archbishoprics. Throughout his time as bishop, he was of a high church persuasion, allowing those churches in his particular jurisdiction, the peculiars, such as Ulverstoke and Havant, have a little more freedom to try out new ideas like candles on the altar, and indeed to call it an altar. In 1850 this was considered to be very avant-garde. Religion at this point in history perhaps had more general interest in England than at any time since the Civil War, and almost everyone felt that they should go to some church on a Sunday, but probably lots didn't actually do so. It was these tensions that underpinned the desire to establish, once and for all, just exactly how many people actually did attend a place of worship on Sunday the 30th of March 1851. This then is the fiction, a Christmas card, chocolate box idea of the Victorian family all strolling off to church arm in arm together. It's partly based on a rather romantic view of the royal family, although their church attendance was irregular to say the least. The royal family, this picture was painted in 1846, whilst keen to be seen to support the established church, were not regular churchgoers, and indeed Queen Victoria was keener to spend time in bed with her virile husband than rising for early church services on a Sunday morning, while the Prince Consort was desperately busy working towards his great exhibition, a science-centred celebration of modern industrial might to take place just 1 month after the census. Perhaps the best-known pen portraits of Victorian people we have are Boz's descriptions of his characters. OK, so Dickens chose stereotypes, perhaps even archetypes for his novels, but they're very likely to represent some of those in the area who really wouldn't have strolled off to the local church or chapel of a wet and miserable Sunday morning. Fagin, and the rest of any Jewish population, if he went anywhere at all, would have attended the synagogue in Portsmouth, one of the oldest in Britain, built in 1780 and completely redecorated beautifully in 1850. Bill Sykes, one of Charles Booth's vicious semi-criminal class, probably sent Nancy and the more respectable urchins to Sunday school, but enjoyed a lie-in after a busy Saturday night's light burglary. Miss Havisham will, of course, have gone to church for her disrupted wedding ceremony. It is generally agreed that he jilted her at the altar. Cause for post-traumatic stress disorder, if ever there was a cause and effect. But many old and infirm invalids hardly ventured out of doors on bad weather if they had the choice and the money to pay a maid to do for them. And the weather, as we have already seen, was foul that week. The Artful Dodger will have been tucked up in some cosy nest, or perhaps hanging around a street corner to try and pick a pocket or two, but like any apprentice worth his salt will have tried his utmost not to be seen in church, unless it was to leer at young ladies, of course. Scrooge, well, it seems unlikely he would attend church. After all, there will be a collection and the need to be polite to people, and of course Picnic will be sleeping off a night in the tavern. Mrs. Bumble is brewing up a big pot of gruel, while Sergeant Buzzfuzz might well have been on duty. You take the point. Just like today, lots of people had very good reason not to feature in a place of worship in the town that Sunday morning. But of course some folks did go, and that will be the second part of this talk, which will follow immediately afterwards, and that you can go to and listen, where I'll list all the churches and give you the numbers from the census, and you can discover all about it. Actually, they had quite a lot of places to go, at least 11.